Hello and welcome to TNA Top 10 for Week 11 of the college football season of 2024. Had to throw the year in there too, Andrew. How's it going, bud?
Well, Terry, you can see behind me, I am studying the air raid offense. And there is a reason for that. I'm studying the air raid offense. So we're going to see, I think, probably a little bit more sophisticated passing game on Saturday. And when we talk about that particular outing, we will go ahead and discuss it. But for now, there's a lot of nonsense happening in the NCAA. Apparently,
Absolutely. We got ADs all pissed off at post game press conferences.
and willing to pay $40,000 to express their opinion about a play. Now, anybody that knows me, I love the ins and outs of football, the technicalities, the rules, the systems, the reason things work, which is why I'm reviewing the air raid offense for Saturday's game. Uh Defensive holding by rule occurs outside the 5-yard bubble from the line of scrimmage while the quarterback is in the pocket.
Hmm.
It is perfectly legal for a defender to jam and hold the receiver for 5 yards, 15 feet, with the quarterback in the pocket. Once they exceed 5 yards, you have to release. Defender did that for Utah. Bad call. Bad call. It was textbook defense from that particular defender. I think it was a corner. Um, really bad call. And again, this has been something that I believe is much more systemic inside the NCAA. It's just not good, Terry. They've missed calls all year long. Miami, which we will discuss up to this weekend, was undefeated because of two bad calls.
Right.
The Nebraska Ohio State game, Nebraska's self-inflicted wounds aside, 6 missed holding calls in that game, where you are seeing jersey in the hands of Ohio State defend or offensive linemen. So, or I guess could have been the running back too. But the bottom line is there's a lot of inconsistency, but it's always been stated or unstated policy, for better or worse, that you don't bash the officials, regardless of who you are, the coaches or the AD.
Right.
The AD called the press conference, or at least took the point on the press conference before Kyle Whittingham ever had a chance to address this. And he sat down and he's the one who said it. So very interesting and a very frustrated Utah team. I had them winning the Pac-12 or Big 12, excuse me, and they are 4-5 and 1-5 in conference. Not good, not good.
But
So
obviously they can play with good teams. They're just not winning those games.
yeah, and I know you got more on that for our review and our new
Oh,
segment,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean they're playing with everybody. They're not, again, finishing. There's no Cam Rising, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's time for Utah to move on from him because he's injured again, but I don't
Well,
know
he hasn't
what.
strung together several games where he's been able to play for the last 2 years. I mean,
Right. Yeah, he's been out more than he's been in.
yeah.
And that's a problem, particularly in an era when you start to pay quarterbacks and pay running backs and pay all these other folks. So, but I had that on the list. I know there was discussion of, the Southeast Conference bias that we may or may not have.
Well,
And
we'll
it's not
we'll we'll
it's
dive
not
into
just
that. I
us.
think we got some visuals of kind of the situation, and we can kind of speak to that. Why don't we move into that right now?
It's going to be a discussion for sure.
So, first slide here, I've got the Week 11 outlook. This is going into the to last week's games. There were no undefeated teams in conference in the SEC. There were 5 teams: Tennessee, Georgia, Texas, Texas A&M, and LSU all had one loss going into last weekend. Alabama, Missouri, Ole Miss all had 2 losses. So that
Correct.
sets up what we saw last weekend, and this changed. Let's go to the first game, and it was a blowout. Ole Miss just puts it on Georgia unexpectedly, 28-10.
So a blowout, yes. I had said last week that I believe that Georgia's defense was too tough for Ole Miss, and I think I was basically listening to you too much, and it's because I always bet on Lane. I always bet on Lane Kiffin, and I did not bet on Lane. I'm the guy that said he's going to win 12 games this year. Well, he's going to have to win a couple playoff games if that's the case now. But to do this to Georgia, even in Oxford,
Right.
pretty clean game. But look at the rushing. A Georgia football team ran for 59 yards, and possessions okay, penalties are okay. But look at the turnovers
Yeah.
again,
Turnovers are going to kill you.
again. Two
3 turnovers.
fumbles and an interception. The big thing I want to emphasize here this week, as I said last week, Georgia's defense is probably the best in the country. Maybe not statistically, but speed, power, experience, always being in the right place. They kicked 7 field goals. Old Miss did. Those 666 points aren't touchdowns and missed PATs. Those are 2 field goals apiece. And add another one in the first quarter. They kicked 7 field goals. 7 times, Terry.
Goodness.
Ole Miss was close enough to score and had to settle for 3.
Give that guy some NIL funds.
So this is also a point of emphasis this year, especially. You have to have a special teams unit that can execute. And I mean, Kiffin knew rather, as good as his offense was playing, Georgia was bending, they weren't breaking. Because every one of those 18 points through the second, third, and fourth quarters represents what could have been a touchdown.
Right.
What could have been a touchdown.
But you got to think that they're going to miss a field goal at some point, and they just didn't do it.
They didn't. It went 7 for 7. And, I saw the first opening sequence and I thought, oh, God, this is going to be a game because it was
Right.
Georgia, then it was Ole Miss, it was Ole Miss, Georgia, Ole Miss. I thought, well, here we go. But Carson Beck has not looked like the championship contending quarterback we'd expected him to. Ole Miss, Jackson Dart did what he does, 263 yards passing against a very good defense of Georgia, from a pass rush to a secondary to the way they play man-to-man and switch out to zone. And look, third down, 4 for 13, and Ole Miss still scored 28.
Right. And
So
Georgia was 6 of 14. They did pretty well on third down.
yeah, but they just didn't do enough with it, and
Couldn't punch it in.
no, and they were frustrated, and I think that rightfully so. They're frustrated. Georgia, even with that one loss to Alabama, didn't look like a team that was gonna have an outside shot. Well, we haven't gotten to our poll yet, but both the AP and the coaches poll dropped them dramatically.
Yeah.
To the 11th spot. So interesting.
I think they were getting the benefit of the doubt because they've had a couple of close games. That Kentucky game was close, but people were saying, "But they're winning."
Well, and the
But
other thing was that defense kept bailing them out.
yeah,
Kept bailing them out, bailing them out, bailing them out. So, who do you got next here, Terry?
I got Florida, Texas, and Texas just put it on them, 35-0 at halftime. Ends up 49-17.
It was a glorified ass whooping. Billy Napier was given a reprieve, so to speak, for the year early in the season or early in the week last week, and was the AD said we're not going to fire him. We're going to keep on with him, and we're not going to pay the $26 million out. We're not going to risk losing recruits that have committed to Florida to play for him. Okay, great. Well, then they go to Austin, and this is the Texas team right now. This is the team with the inside track to the SEC championship game based on the remaining schedule. Toughest game, of course, being A&M, and we'll get there when we reveal the rankings.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing Florida did Saturday went right, Terry. Nothing went right for them. The 17 points they scored was in garbage time for all intents and purposes.
Right.
Sark had already started subbing his guys in and out. I mean, it was 42-3 and he starts bringing in the second and the third team, to play. So Ewers threw 5 touchdowns Saturday, so that was a record for him. You look what they did offensively. Look at the defense. They didn't make a lot of mistakes. Yes, they had the one fumble. 7 penalties, probably a little high for a Texas team, but they bounced back very nicely, is what I'm getting at.
Right.
That off week helped them, and they're gonna be able to battle this one out the rest of the
Yeah,
season.
nice balanced offense. And you had mentioned the buyout for Florida. Um, I heard something the other day. I think it was that Siski guy talking about things are different now. Teams, Florida considering doing a buyout. Texas A&M did a big buyout last year. Auburn buys somebody out every 3 years or so. But with NIL and having to pay these guys so much money, you're having to go to the same boosters and say, "Hey, can you give me $30 million to buy out a coach?" And then you want to turn around to the same boosters and say, "Hey, I need $2 million for a quarterback." So you better have a lot of boosters that are willing to pay some money, because you might have to say, "Well, for the sake of recruiting, we're going to let him stay." They got to make
Mm,
bigger decisions now because there's not as much money to go around unless you got just some really deep pockets.
the 12th man at A&M.
That's right. And they do. So that's why they bought Jimbo out.
Yeah.
Let's
No
move
other
along.
team, no other team in the college would easily do that. The way
Right.
they just wrote the check, you know.
Exactly. So we got
Woo!
Alabama,
Ah,
LSU, and night game in Baton Rouge. Who gives a shit? Alabama just steamrolled 'em.
I said 17 and you said you're crazy. And buddy, in the rain,
Yeah.
under the lights, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the Alabama Crimson Tide, particularly the quarterback who had gone pretty quiet in this Heisman discussion, lit
He
the
showed up.
Tigers on fire. I mean, he lit their asses up Saturday night.
Three turnovers.
He had 4 rushing touchdowns, Jalen Milroe did. Yeah, LSU, 3 turnovers, penalties about even, but you look at the rushing, 311 yards on the ground. There is a point when you are running that well that you are breaking the defense's spirit, and that is
Yeah.
exactly what they did. Eh, eh, Kelly's a good enough coach. Quarterback spy. You've got to cover him. You've got
Right.
to account for him. He's such a dangerous weapon. But we have talked about this, early in the season before the Alabama loss to Vandy, when I said the problem with Alabama is that Jalen Milroe can go 5 out. He can play empty set. He can play I. He can play shotgun. He can play quarterback read. He can hit the hook, the dig, the flat. He can hit the slant, and he can hit the go. I said the problem with all of that is he's such a dangerous quarterback, and then you have to account for him. LSU Saturday night, of all things to abandon, was the quarterback run. And they did not protect they did not protect the integrity of the line. Their defensive linemen did not stay even with him. They kept over pursuing, and it's a one stick foot in the ground, and he's gone, Terry. And once he gets going, once Milroe's got that speed, that once he goes, he's gone. Your defensive line aren't going to catch him. Your linebackers aren't going to catch him. And they ran LSU's ass up and down the field. That defense was so gassed and so exhausted by the time it was all said and done. You're doing it in the rain. You're doing it at home. You're doing it in front of 85 or 90,000 people at Tiger Stadium. And you just had Alabama pick you up and break you over their knee and just break your back.
Well, not only that, you talk about the 300 yards rushing, but they also were 10 of 13 on third down. And that's a defense that continually gets to third down and can't make the stop. And that's going to kill you as a defense. You think you're there, and then you don't stop them, and the drive continues and they score.
Yeah, it is not good. It just does not work that way. And you have to be able to come up with those stops.
Hmm.
And let's face it, everything showed that this was LSU's game to lose. And Alabama came in there, and we've seen Alabama come in there and win before, Terry.
Right.
I I think the last time they won like this, Bryce Young was the quarterback. I think they won pretty big the year they went to the SEC championship and took down Georgia, and then went to the national championship game when he won the Heisman.
Yeah,
But most of the time, this is a closer game than
yeah,
29 points. And it really wasn't a 29-point game up until the very end. I mean, LSU scored at the very end of the other, because it was 42-6 at the end of the fourth quarter.
right.
So I say all that to say LSU is exactly who I thought they were. They still don't play defense good enough to win the SEC. Brian Kelly refuses to adapt and would rather complain about what the other team is doing defensively than make the adjustments necessary to win football games.
All right, so LSU is exposed, like you said, and let's move along and see what has happened to the SEC because of this weekend. So I showed you what it was like before the weekend, and here's what it looks like after. So we got three teams with one loss. Nobody's undefeated in conference. We got Tennessee, Texas, and Texas A&M. We got Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, Ole Miss, and LSU all with two losses. And I've got the remaining games on here.
Mm-hmm.
So the big ones, obviously, we got Tennessee and Georgia this weekend. A&M plays Texas at the end. Really, is there anything else on here? I mean, Missouri. There, I don't.
Don't
I don't
sleep
know.
on Vandy if you're Tennessee.
Well, that's true.
Even though South Carolina beat them pretty handily this weekend, don't sleep on Vanderbilt.
Some games they show up, some games they don't. They're one of those teams.
So respectfully, because I see Auburn on here,
Mhm.
um,
Oh,
Tennessee,
Auburn is possibly going with a true freshman quarterback, so there's not much that's going to happen.
so respectfully, Alabama should win out.
Yeah,
Georgia, the Tennessee game looks like it's going to be the one to give them trouble, because if they
yeah,
have trouble, is that UMass?
it
They
is.
got UMass game 11. If
Yeah,
they have trouble with UMass game 11, Kirby's done. Um, Now I don't want to be Missouri with the Gamecocks, Mississippi State, and Arkansas. Ole Miss, Florida, Mississippi State, LSU, Florida, Vandy, and Oklahoma. So Alabama to me wins out. Texas, um,
either A&M or Texas is going to win out. Whoever wins that game.
yeah, yeah. And then Georgia, I would like to say should win out, but the way they played this weekend, they couldn't get that offense going, and Tennessee has a pretty good defensive front as well.
It
So
really comes down to that game. And I know you talk about the Vandy game. Tennessee should beat Vandy, but you never know.
yeah. Yeah, and when we reveal who we ranked in the top 12, I will explain who I and why I rank. But I think Texas has this pretty much under control. The
Mhm.
A&M game being their X factor, because I want to point this out, Terry. There is one team in the SEC who has held their combined opponents to less than 100 points defensively, and it's Texas. And they're going up against two of the three teams that don't score very well.
Right,
Because Arkansas, despite Bobby Petrino being the offensive coordinator, has not lived up to that hype.
right.
And University of Kentucky, excuse me, we know they're not there to play offense. So anyway,
Played a good game against Georgia, but they're not getting it done.
and I will say this too. I still think 5 teams can make the SEC, make the Big 12 or the 12 playoff.
Right.
And there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be pissed off when 2 or 3 or 4 of them have 2 losses.
Well, that's the thing about this. There are 8 teams within a game of each other at the top of the conference.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
saying something. Nobody's running away with
because right now it's A&M and Tennessee for the benefit of the alphabet, followed by Texas because they haven't played the same amount of games.
it. Right.
So, anyway,
Let's move on to the next conference, and that is the ACC. Going into last weekend, we had 2 undefeated teams in conference. That was Miami and SMU. SMU's one loss was outside of the conference. Teams with one loss included Clemson and Pittsburgh, and there were four teams with two losses. That was Louisville, Syracuse, Virginia Tech, and Wake Forest, and this changed quite a bit this weekend. Let's see.
So Terry doesn't get any heat. Clemson has two losses, but one of those was to Georgia, just for the record.
Yes, that's where the in conference comes from on the undefeated part, and it also goes down.
Understood, but you didn't carry it down. That's all I was saying. SMU, of course, took the loss to BYU. So,
That's right.
Terry, what do we got?
We got Miami getting their butts kicked by Georgia Tech.
Yep. Time of
And
possession, third down.
That's right. And they came, they came close to losing, probably should have lost a couple of games, but Georgia Tech is that team over and over again. They're not going to have a great record themselves, but they're going to play with everybody and they're going to beat somebody.
Well, you look at the ball control, 35 minutes.
Yep.
They rushed the ball 271 yards. We know Miami doesn't play defense. We've compared them to the Southern Cal teams where they toy with their look at it, 436 yards. And you lose to Virginia Tech because their defense bends and doesn't break.
Right. Georgia
That's
Tech.
simple. Yeah, Georgia Tech's defense didn't break.
Right.
And then, like good teams do, even when they're just playing the spoiler, when they needed the turnover, they got the strip sack. And that sealed the ball game.
That's right. And they held Miami at 88 yards rushing. I know they had nearly 350 yards passing, but that ball control and not letting Miami run, this is how you beat teams with more talent.
Yep.
Georgia Tech does that as well as anybody in the country.
Yeah, and let's not forget Georgia Tech was the team that knocked off Florida State to open the season and really put Florida State derailed them. Really. I mean that they exposed
Absolutely.
Florida
Set the
State,
tone.
but it really gave people the blueprint to beat Florida State. And now, unfortunately, for our friends who are Florida State fans, I think Florida State has all but waved the white flag at this point, and we can talk about that when we get to the Notre Dame game. So,
well, let's do that right now because that's the next game. 52-3, Notre Dame puts it on Florida State, and they're just not in this. I mean,
no.
Florida State, the players, they have talent. They have way more talent than their record shows. And this is just not a team that is playing together, that is not playing for their coaches or each other. And, they're ready for the season to be over. Who knows what happens next, whether we got a bunch of transfers. I don't know. It's yet to be seen.
Well, and Norvell made the move that every coach in crisis makes. He fired his offensive coordinator, his defensive coordinator, and his wide receivers coach. Again, it's not to be funny or to be demeaning about our buddy Dave and people like him that love Florida State. This team is not even showing up. The Florida State Miami or Florida State Notre Dame game, excuse me, huge game. And Notre Dame, in a very balanced attack in South Bend, just put it on them and did so with 7 less minutes of possession. Look at the third down, Terry. 3 for 17. So you're good enough to get to hold the ball that long that you have 17 first downs, but you're not doing anything with it. You're not scoring. And I don't know why. I don't have an explanation. I've had conversation with my buddy Dave, who is a very adamant Florida State fan, the same way I am about Nebraska. He pays attention. He roots for them. He knows what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. There is no explanation to take this big a loss because Notre Dame is a very good football team. They're not an elite football team. And Florida State, to your point, the way you began this conversation, Terry, has far more talent than 3 points.
Right. This is the kind of team, and I've seen it as an Auburn fan multiple times. Auburn will have a new coach come in and they'll go undefeated the first year. Why did they go undefeated the first year? Because they came in and they energized a group of guys that were already talented that the previous guy was not able to bring together. So it's possible that Florida State could do that. In 2024, it might be more difficult with the easy transfers. Who knows who's going to leave? But sometimes those guys that leave, you're better off because they left. So there might be some of those. They can bring some guys in. If Norvell, you know, it, it sounds like he's going to be there next year. Or at least that's what the indication is at the moment. I don't know. How do you energize the talent that you have? Can you do that if your team has given up on you this season? Are they going to play for the same guy next year? Better? I don't. That is a difficult task, but that's what they have ahead of 'em.
Yeah, it's going to be a 2-10 team because Florida is going to eat them up, and they have the benefit of a bye week in Charleston Southern following that, and then
Yeah,
they've got Florida. They got the Gators. That's a much better football team than we thought they would be. Um,
they are.
but there's no explanation for the Seminoles to fall like this from 13-1 to what looks like it's going to be 2-10. Um, and like I say, Norvell did the same thing that every head coach in crisis does. You fire your coordinators, and
You
he
do.
and he added a wide receivers coach to it. Um, and by the first week of December, you won't recognize the Florida State coaching staff.
Right.
So he's going to have to clean house. But what we also know is in the era of the NIL and the transfer portal, they'll all just leave. You
That's
got to
right.
win, or they'll just leave. So
And what are you going to do to bring guys in to replace them? That's the difficult part when you keep the same coach. Are you bringing the guys in? Because I know they got guys that are, they'll have guys that transfer. They're going to have guys that flip. What are they going to do to be able to bring guys in to field a team next year to do something?
and
You have
they've
to be
already, unfortunately, they've already had a number decommit.
right.
The decommitment has become another thing in college football that we can probably talk about in the off season. It used to be when you signed to be with the school, you were going to be with that school. That's no longer the case, Terry.
Oh yeah, that one Alabama guy went to Wisconsin and then went back to Alabama.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Didn't
let's move along.
take them long.
So here's the outlook of the ACC after Week 11. SMU, now that Miami had the loss, is the only undefeated team in the conference, undefeated in conference games, as we said. Clemson um, still only has one loss, so Miami and Clemson are right there. And there were a lot of two-loss teams that had losses this week. The only two-loss team that won was Louisville, and they may not have even played. Honestly, I don't remember. But Pittsburgh also lost this week, so that drops them down to two losses. So unless something crazy happens, it looks like SMU is going to play either Miami or Clemson to end this thing.
Yeah, and the deal with SMU is they got BC, Virginia, and Cal. We know
They
what
could lose.
Cal can. They could lose one of them, but I don't think they will. I think that SMU wins out. They've hit that stride.
Yeah,
Clemson, the game to circle is the Gamecocks. But that doesn't actually affect the conference,
right.
which they could be a 3-loss team, but 2 of them occurred outside the conference, so it
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
they do
Wake
have the Citadel, so
Yeah.
that's an easy.
Wake Forest, Syracuse, I don't think they've got enough in the tank for Miami after a
No,
bye week. So
no.
it's ultimately going to come down to that middle line. If they tie, who do you give the style points to? And that's, some discussion that we've already had inside of our group chat is who do you give the style points to for the championship game? Is it
And we
I is
will
it is
discuss
it
that Clemson
you or
Pitt game. I mean, we'll discuss that later on what chance we give Pitt there, but um, I don't know. I don't know what the tiebreaker is at this point.
Well, I mean, it is head-to-head, strength of schedule, common opponents, etc., and then they've added several others. But
Right.
once you get past those, but Clemson also has 2 non-conference games with SEC talent on their team between
Yeah.
Georgia and South Carolina, and then again they've got the Citadel. But it wasn't like Miami played anybody in their non-conference schedule, so yeah. pretty interesting conversation we may have in a couple weeks. But it's the
Yeah,
Mustangs to lose. The
it is.
spot in the ACC title game is the Mustangs to lose.
And that's pretty exciting for SMU.
Yeah.
All the talk about the ACC schools coming in.
Hey, we didn't give them any credit in the preseason.
That's correct. Because it wasn't the good ACC teams that went to the ACC.
No,
It wasn't the good Pac 12 teams that went to the ACC. But SMU is the one showing up.
correct.
All right, let's move along to the Big 12. And coming into the weekend, BYU was undefeated, sitting at the top. Three teams with one loss, including Colorado, Iowa State, and Kansas State, and four teams with two losses: Arizona State, West Virginia, Texas Tech, and Cincinnati.
And remember,
Two
that's in conference because Colorado got that ass whooped by Nebraska. But go ahead, Harry.
Let's see what happened this weekend. First game we show is Iowa State taking a loss to Kansas out of nowhere. Because we talked last week about how Kansas was in the top 25 to start the season and only had one FBS win. Well, they got a 9-point victory against Iowa State this weekend.
Yeah, and it tells you how bad Kansas really is. They blew a 31 to 13 point lead and let it get that close. Iowa State fumbled this, no pun intended. I mean,
Right.
you look at the rushing attack of Kansas, the ball control again. Where was the defense of Iowa State? 532 yards they allowed Kansas in
Man.
Lawrence. I get it, it's in Lawrence. But I mean, this Kansas team looks like they win ball games, Terry. This isn't the
Right.
Kansas team we've seen all year. This is
This is the
that.
one that we kind of thought we would see this year.
Yeah. And no turnovers
Right.
and 50% on first or third down. I mean, it is what it is. But it is going to be a very interesting finish in the Big 12 too, and we're going to get there in a second.
Oh, yeah. We talk about the SEC being chaotic, but the Big 12 is pretty chaotic on their own. Why don't we move along? And we got another game. BYU still undefeated, a 1-point victory and a controversial call. But you talked about this to start the show. The AD comes out, Utah AD comes out with criticism, but we got a 5-yard cushion here. You can do some things 5 yards off the ball. And I don't know that everybody seems to understand that.
Right. And you got a 21-point third quarter by Utah. You've got 3 turnovers committed by Utah. They hold BYU to 1 out of 12 third downs. And look at the penalties there, Terry.
1 out of
20
12.
penalties for 157 combined. I mean, this is a sloppy football game.
It is. 1 out of 12 is pretty horrendous.
Horrendous. And then on Utah's part, having that type of ball control, and you commit 3 turnovers,
Right.
a fumble and 2 picks. Absolutely just insanity. I think Utah has a legitimate complaint because that also, the one thing we didn't talk about is that defensive holding negated a safety. It
Right.
would have had to been reviewed, but it looked like it negated a safety. Well, that's 2 points plus possession.
Hmm.
So we're not talking, and then you're talking about a 9-point total swing, and that's without Utah scoring again. So I I think they've got a legitimate gripe. I think the officiating has been bad all around, but again, BYU finds a way to win, but they did it sloppily,
Right. But
and they did it.
BYU has won some pretty tough games this year. This is similar to Miami wins that we were giving them credit for because, sometimes you just have to deal with that. So, ranking BYU is an interesting thing this week after the controversy.
Yes, very much so. But
But
they're the only. Oh wait, I don't want. Well, no, they remain undefeated. The only undefeated team in the Big 12.
that's right. So here's the Big 12 after this week's games. BYU, they've got
Kansas.
Kansas, Arizona State and Houston. I got a little mixed up in the two games. I was like, didn't they just play Kansas? No, they just played Utah. So Kansas, Arizona State, and Houston coming up. And Arizona State's decent. Um, Colorado is now the only one-loss team in Big 12 play. They've got Utah, Kansas, and Oklahoma State. And honestly, those are three pretty tough games if the teams show up. Every one
Mhm.
of these teams is capable of beating Colorado.
Yeah, it's funny that Colorado, the way they started, is now in the driver's seat to
Right.
get their championship. They've got a way to get there. Arizona State, not a slouch team. Kansas, we just learned, can play football. Houston has pulled a couple of upsets. I mean, there's a lot of football left to be played in those three games, Terry. It's going to be meaningful. And if
Right.
for some reason BYU and Kansas lose, um, or BYU and Colorado lose, you talk about chaos.
Yeah. And I mean, I think Colorado's probably favored in all three of these games, but they are not easy cupcake games by any means. And then it drops you down with these other four teams. Arizona State's got BYU left to play, so that's a tough game there. Um, let's see, who's got the easiest road of these four? I don't know. Kansas State's got Iowa State. They've got each other. West Virginia probably has the simplest, I would say, of those four. Baylor, UCF, and Texas Tech.
The problem with West Virginia is they're so inconsistent, they'll lose two
Yeah,
of those three games.
they're the Georgia Tech of the Big 12.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
that'll be interesting to see. I think that's the most chaotic other than the SEC at this point.
I would agree.
All right, let's move along, and that takes us to the Big Ten. And the Big Ten's pretty clean with four big teams up top, but we've got coming in to play this weekend. We had Oregon and Indiana undefeated overall. Ohio State and Penn State with one loss in conference. Um, I would expect Penn State would be under Ohio State considering the head-to-head there. And then Iowa and Minnesota both came in with two losses in conference coming into play this weekend. First game we're going to talk about is Indiana and Michigan, and this ended up a little closer than I expected because Michigan won the second half 12-3, but Indiana wins 20-15.
Yeah, the Indiana Hoosiers gritty team found a way to win in the big house. Not a lot of offense in this football game, Terry.
Not
This
at
is
all.
what we like to call a Big Ten football game in November. Um, they each had a turnover. They've each had a few penalties. They each had possession. Third down was
Nobody's
an issue.
running the ball very well.
Nobody. And the thing is, Indiana's offense with their RPO gets a lot of press, but their defense averaging 17 points a game. Their defense is holding teams to an average of 17 points a game. And that's good enough to win.
Yeah.
So, as he said, Google me, Pignetti, and he keeps winning. And he keeps getting it right on his end, Terry, that all he does is win.
And they'll do it ugly if they have to do it ugly. And that's
Well,
kind
and
of what happened.
there was a little bit of chatter and criticism about Indiana's win here about how, Michigan is quote dog shit. Okay, Michigan
No,
is still Michigan. Okay. This
they
is
still
still
play pretty good defense.
this is still the big house. They still play pretty good defense. And let's face it, Terry, because we've both seen it on in our own team fandom. Every championship team has a game that challenges them
That's right.
somewhere. Indiana has gone almost entirely unencumbered to this 10-0 record that they have right now.
Right.
Michigan just gave them the best. I mean, they beat Michigan State 47-13 or 47-10 in East Lansing. Now they've gone on the road and they've beat Michigan in the big house. They have a week off and they get Ohio State in the horseshoe. So that's going to be showdown time. And I hope it's a night game because I want to be able to watch all of it. But anyway, what's up next, Harry?
That was the only Big Ten game we
Okay.
featured. So, what the results of this weekend? The two teams that had two losses in conference dropped out. That was Iowa and I don't remember who else it was.
Minnesota.
Minnesota. That's correct. And the four teams that I mentioned, Oregon, Indiana, Ohio State, and Penn State, they remain where they were because everybody won. Oregon and Indiana um, control their own destiny, but Indiana's got a game with Ohio State coming up in a couple of weeks that it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So that's the big game remaining for the rest of the season to tell the tale of the Big Ten. And if Ohio State wins that game, I would expect Ohio State to be the team, considering they have wins over both Penn State and Indiana. But I also don't know exactly what the rules are in the Big Ten.
No, I would imagine that's 100% correct because when you go to strength of schedule, even Penn State's going to have a top 5 win or Ohio State will have a top 5 win over Penn State. They're going to have a win over, or they're going to have a 1 point loss over Oregon. They're going to have a top 5 win over Indiana because that's going to be a top 5 matchup. If Ohio State won, let's stipulate.
Right.
Um, Indiana's case is they beat Ohio State and went undefeated. That's the only way they're going to
Oh,
get to the championship game. Um, Now Penn State cannot get to the Big Ten championship game. I do not believe. Um,
not easily. There's got to be an upset somewhere, I would
I mean,
think.
they're gonna have to have Purdue beat Indiana and Michigan beat Ohio State after Indiana beats
Right.
Ohio State, and
Yeah, something
and
crazy.
and we haven't really discussed it. But as for Oregon, the Wisconsin team has been much of a disappointment, and Washington got waxed by Penn State this weekend. I think Oregon is probably a lock for the Big Ten
Yeah,
championship. But to your point, the Indiana Ohio State game, that's going to be the one. Because ultimately, everything else is going to fall in place with that game. And I don't believe Penn State should lose another game this year. They'll be 11-1 again at the end of the season. I guess last year they were 10-2. But another double-digit season for James Franklin.
that's right. And this year with a 12-team playoff, I got to tell you, I know nobody's going to admit this, but you almost want to not be having to play that conference championship game. If you can get in without making that conference championship game, now you got to be in a good enough conference to do that. Then you just slide right in there and play in the field of 12.
Yeah. Very valid point.
All right, here's some other scores. Army is still undefeated at 9-0 after a 14-3 win over North Texas. We talked about Pitt with a loss. They lost to Virginia 24-19. Clemson beats Virginia Tech 24-14. Colorado 41-27 over Texas Tech. Iowa with their loss that we talked about a minute ago to UCLA 20-17. And all of a sudden UCLA's got a couple of wins lately out of nowhere.
Yep.
Oregon wins at home 39-18 against Maryland. Penn State with another win. They just keep winning 35-6 against Washington. And Boise, who is probably in the driver's seat for one of those 12 spots, wins 28-21 against Nevada.
What helps Boise is their one loss is to the number 1 team in the country, and it
Right.
was a non-conference loss. Couple notes real quick, Terry, on the Maryland game. Dylan Gabriel passes, I forget, Case Keenum
Okay.
for number of combined touchdowns in NCAA history, either rushing or passing. And by the way, Oregon has 3 more football games.
What's that number at? It was like 100 and something, right?
139, if I'm not mistaken.
Goodness,
If
it's
it's not,
way above 100 and something. Yeah.
no, if it's not 139, it's 149.
Okay.
But the point being, he's got 3 more games against teams that aren't going to necessarily fight him.
Right.
It might get real ugly real fast,
Well, actually, they got a bye week, so they got
or
2
2
more.
more teams. So, well, they've got Wisconsin and Washington. They're not necessarily going to fight Oregon.
Right. Exactly.
So, anyway, he's got a lot of room to be able to add to that list. What's up next, Harry?
We're doing the top 10 for this week, and thanks everybody who voted. We really appreciate that, and we know that it's getting really interesting with fewer undefeated teams out there. Some of these losses are to good teams. How far do you drop somebody like Georgia? How far do you drop Miami? Let's see what we did. Number 10, BYU hangs in there in the top 10. Pretty impressive set of wins they have. They are the team that beat SMU at SMU second week of the season. So,
Yeah.
that's a big deal. And they had some pretty big blowouts against, I mean, they beat Kansas State pretty bad. So I
Yep.
think people look over BYU, but they keep winning. The last few games, they're getting in the meat of their season. They've had to pull out some close games, but they keep doing it. At this point of the season, a win is a win is a win. You just want to get to next week without injuries and keep winning. They've got Kansas on the schedule this week.
Right. And Kansas and then Arizona State and Houston. So
Yeah,
they're not done yet. It's not over.
that's right.
But BYU is probably in the spot that it deserves to be, considering they are undefeated.
Right.
But there are far better teams than BYU out there.
There are. And let's look at number 9. Miami drops to number 9. I think this is mostly because they got one actual loss. We've talked about a couple of games that they were fortunate with the referee calls and that kind of thing, but the people voted them to number 9. They got a bye week this week after the Georgia Tech loss, and they'll finish the season with Wake Forest and traveling to Syracuse.
Yeah, Wake Forest is not a good football team. Syracuse is better than average, but
Right.
it also's got enough inconsistency. You're not exactly sure which team you're going to get. Miami has an outside shot, but they've got to close. They've got to finish 11-1 so they can get to the ACC tournament. Because again, it's the inside track is the Mustangs. The Mustangs have the inside track to that game. So Terry, number 8.
Is
Oh
Ole
man,
Miss. Ole
what?
Miss after their win. Yeah,
What?
well, hey, we got some Ole Miss fans voting on these things, remember?
What? My God, above Alabama, roll
Well,
tide,
you don't know that.
or below Alabama, roll tide. Anyway, Kentucky and LSU are the losses. Florida, Mississippi State coming up. It depends on which version of Ole Miss's offense comes,
Yeah,
but those last 2 games should be wins for Lane.
they
That'll be
should.
10 wins for 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5, I forget, seasons in Oxford.
That's right. And that
Now
doesn't happen in Oxford.
that is impressive.
It
If
is.
he and honestly, if he wins out, you can't deny Ole Miss a spot in the playoff. Even if it's a lower seed, they're not going
Right.
to be able to keep him out.
And that's the thing, I keep reiterating Ole Miss being the Penn State of the SEC, but they beat Georgia by 18 points.
Yep. And
So
it
let's
looked
give
good.
Lane
And
some
the way
credit.
they did it was with defense. It wasn't
Yeah,
that high flying offense because that offense kept getting stopped. Their
right.
defense is what actually gave them those opportunities to win this football game.
Number 7, Tennessee. They got the one loss at Arkansas. They got the big game at Georgia coming up this weekend. I mean, that's going to be their season right there.
Yep. And then UTEP and Vandy. And I would love if Vandy beat them because that would be Vandy played Georgia close, beat Alabama, beat Auburn,
Yep,
and then got Tennessee. And the reason that matters is those are the SEC teams they played that have won national titles.
that's right. That's right. And then, what kind of crazy story would it be if Tennessee ends up winning this game at Georgia and then loses at Vanderbilt to end the
Oh
season?
God, I'd love it. It would be great because it's
Oh,
chaos. That's what makes it
it's
so much
absolute
fun.
chaos. I'm here for it. Number 6, Notre Dame. They got the week 2 loss to Northern Illinois. They blasted Navy. They blasted Georgia Tech. They blasted Florida State. I mean, they had a win that was fairly close against Louisville, but got that win to start the season at Texas A&M. Notre Dame's good.
They're very good, and they've done the right thing since the loss, and that is blow teams out and make it look very uneven because let's face it, they're going to get the flack. Well, they don't have a tough schedule because they've got Navy and they've got Army and they've got Stanford, and they've got a Florida State team that couldn't win uh, anything right now. And they have USC, which is a team that's up and down, and we're going to talk about them shortly. But um, yeah, I think Notre Dame's a very good football team. I think they're a little bit high, but I don't think you can deny them a playoff spot right now either. And Army is undefeated until they play Notre Dame.
And I think they got a coaching staff that's doing better this year than some mistakes they made last year.
Correct. Marcus Freeman's learning as a young coach. He's a few years older than I am. He's right between our ages, Terry. And I think he's 41. He's not an
Okay.
old dude at all.
Right.
And Al Golden is the defensive coordinator there. I mean, they do a great job together. And then they get the offensive fire. I mean, look at the scores. They it's not that they don't know how to play deep offense.
Right.
They can score too. So anyway, we'll see what they can do against Virginia because Virginia, of course, played spoiler this weekend against Pitt. So,
Right.
we'll see how that transpires. Top five.
Number 5, Indiana at 10-0. They got a bye week, well earned, and then they go on the road to Ohio State next week, and it's going to be a huge game.
Huge game. But the one thing that tells me something about Cignetti, and I don't know that all of the people talking about Indiana and how they lack any challenging or whatever is forgetting about. This is a Nick Saban disciple
Right.
who you've now given 2 weeks to prepare for the biggest game of his coaching career with a run pass offense that is very, very good and a defense that is fundamentally sound, special teams that don't make a lot of mistakes. What does that sound like to you? Sounds like Alabama football.
It sounds like he got the recipe from somebody he worked for before, and he's
Yeah.
using it pretty well.
Yeah. So we'll see. Number four, Terry, because now I'm very interested.
Number 4 is Penn State with one loss in the to Ohio State and the Big Ten. They've got Purdue on the road this week and at Minnesota, and then they host Maryland in the season. So nothing there should challenge.
No, and Purdue, I don't believe we're picking this game. Purdue is god awful, horrible, the doormat of the Big Ten. This should be a blowout, one sided, not close, 40 points. Dial it up. I mean, it
The
should not
fact,
be.
yeah, sorry, the fact that Penn State is a notch above Indiana tells me that most people think Ohio State's going to beat Indiana.
Correct.
Number 3, here's Texas, top SEC team. They've got their 15-point loss to Georgia, but they played well. They had a close game at Vanderbilt, but otherwise they've steamrolled everybody.
And beat teams that were ranked and beat teams that were supposed to give them a little bit of fight from Michigan to Oklahoma. And now they've got the back end of their schedule. The showdown is A&M
That's
Thanksgiving
right.
weekend.
All right, I think we know the top 2 teams. Number 2, Ohio State, with their 1-point loss at Oregon earlier in the season. They are at Northwestern this week, and then they finish off hosting Indiana, followed by hosting Michigan. And neither of those games should be simple. I know Michigan is a little bit down, but we're talking about Ohio State, Michigan. And if Michigan's going to show up, that's going to be the game.
100%.
That means that Oregon is the number 1 team at 10-0. They
Quack,
go to
quack.
Wisconsin this week. I think I had the bye week in Wisconsin swapped on the other graphic, so a little bit wrong there. And then they finish out with Washington, the 2 Pac-12 teams, or 2 of the Pac-12 teams coming in and finishing out the season against each other to end their first Big Ten season. No surprise there. They deserve it.
They definitely do, and they just keep winning. And you talk about margin of victory, Terry, with the exception of those first couple games, Boise and I guess not couple, Boise and Ohio State. Everything
Mhm.
has not been close.
Right.
They have just showcased their talent in all 3 phases of football.
I knew that I had a score wrong on one of these. It said Ohio State Oregon score on this slide. Supposed to
Yeah,
be
30.
32-31.
Yep.
I couldn't find it. I was searching for it. Anyway, let me run it down. You got number 10, BYU, number 9, Miami, number 8, Ole Miss, number 7, Tennessee, number 6, Notre Dame, number 5, Indiana, number 4, Penn State, number 3, Texas, number 2, Ohio State, and number 1, the Oregon Ducks, yet again.
Let me point out, just because it's who we are, our listeners, for the first time in the history of this show, have excluded both Alabama and Georgia from the top 10.
Hmm.
Georgia has never been out of the top 10 on this show. And I don't know, Terry, that they've been out of the top 5 ever
Yeah,
in
I
all
don't
the
know.
time we've done this.
Probably not. If I
Interesting.
recollect properly, they are numbers 11 and 12, but I would have to go double check.
But all I'm saying is, first time ever.
Absolutely.
And more so Georgia than Alabama, but still,
Right.
first time ever.
All right. So let's move along and talk about playoff seeding. And here's our picks for that. We both have Oregon, number 1 seed after winning the Big Ten. I've got Texas, number 2 seed. You've got Tennessee with the SEC championship here.
The reason for Tennessee is they have the one more conference game.
Okay.
So if I have to pick between Tennessee and A&M for my 2 spot, because of the number of games played in conference, they get the 2 spot. I ultimately think Texas is the best team in the SEC. But
Okay.
because of who I am and how I do things, Tennessee gets to occupy this position.
All right. Yeah. So there
Because
is a lot of
they're
ifs. Yeah.
4-1 in conference versus 5-1
Right.
ultimately.
So I've got Miami still at the number 3 seed winning the ACC. There's a lot of maybe us doing things differently and seeing it differently. And you've got SMU. SMU is technically sitting at the top, so that makes sense.
I also think SMU can win out.
That would be very interesting to see. We got Miami, we got Clemson, we got Florida State, and SMU comes in and wins the ACC.
Yeah, I
What a
think
heck of a
SMU
story.
can win out with their season. Yes, sir.
All
And
right.
then BYU we put in the 4 spot because it's
Right.
BYU now. Now I put Texas at 5 again.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have even been Tennessee. Tennessee I had down about where you have them.
Yeah, number 8. Yeah.
But because I wanted to do it the way I feel like we should,
Yeah.
not saying you did it wrong, it's just the way
Right.
I did it. I mean, because my ultimate thought was Texas is the best team in the SEC, but they're one conference game short right now, whatever.
Okay.
But you got Ohio State 5, I've got Texas 5, you've got Penn State 6, I got Ohio State 6, Indiana we're even, Penn State, 10th at Notre Dame, Alabama, Ole Miss you have, and I didn't have.
Right. You got Georgia 11, and we both have Boise at 12. If Boise ends up losing, I'm going to have to relook at some teams because I'm not sure who I would think would go there.
Well, and like I say, Boise, your point about them, they've got that very good running back who just
Right.
continues to power that football team. And they're winning. They only beat Nevada by a touchdown, but they're winning pretty handily up to that point.
Yeah.
And a one loss they played with Oregon.
Right.
So
Do we think he's leading the Heisman at this point after the
no,
Miami loss?
no, I still think it's Cam Ward.
Okay. And Cam
Now,
Ward's
now
got
there are
plenty of
people.
opportunity the rest of
This is where I hate the bullshit, though, Terry. And I know we're over time, and I want to get
the
long winded here. This is where I hate it, though, because now they're like, well, Cam Ward's lost, so he might no longer be the Heisman. Wait a minute, does that change the fact that he's the best player in the country? Because I
And
thought that's what the Heisman was for.
right, and Boise State is sitting there not undefeated. So what's the
Yeah,
difference?
but I've heard that chatter already that they lost to Georgia Tech. That doesn't change the fact he threw for 300 and whatever that number was.
348, I think it was.
Yeah, because he took the sack that ended the game. Okay,
Right.
But anyway, I know we have another piece of business to take care of. Terry, is it prediction time?
It is Week 12 games we care about, and I've looked over this over and over. I'm pretty sure everything on here is correct. Oh, so many things to look at. Anyway, first game of the week, we got Texas at Arkansas at noon on Saturday, and Texas is favored by 13 and a half. And I think it's going to be 21.
I was just going to say, you and I are on the same wavelength already. Not enough points because Arkansas is not going to have enough talent to match up with Texas, and everything could fall their way, and Texas is still going to win this football game. So I'm going to take Texas I'll double them up, buddy, 27.
All
It's a
right.
big number, but they just rolled Florida. So,
Right.
I
I
mean,
think they're finding their whatever again.
their groove, their mojo,
Their
their juice, their
yeah, one of
whatever.
those
Yeah.
words that I couldn't come up with.
Yeah.
The next game, also Saturday at noon, we got Clemson at Pitt, and Clemson is favored on the road at Pitt by 10. Pitt has started to fall, and Vegas seems to think they're going to continue to fall. 10 feels like a big number. I mean, I know Clemson can show up and put it on somebody, but it feels big to me.
Historically, Pittsburgh has beaten Clemson before. Um, it's not an unfamiliar game. Defensively, I think Clemson probably has the edge in terms of athletes. Not
Right.
necessarily production, but in terms of what they can do athletically. Clemson had a little bit of trouble with Virginia Tech this weekend,
That's right.
and I think I get some of those things cleaned up a little bit, and I'm gonna take Clemson, but I'll take them by 9.
Okay. I'm going to take Clemson by 4. I think it's going to be a pretty close game the whole way, but I think Clemson just has a little bit more talent, and that's going to show up on the road at Pitt. But I think Pitt is a little bit better than Vegas is giving them credit for. All right, let's move to Boulder, also Saturday at noon, and Colorado is favored by 10 points against Utah.
Seems like a lot, but Utah's offense without Cam Rising is not any good. Defensively, they're going to be good. I think the heavy hitters of Colorado have started to show up. The Travis Hunter, the Shador Sanders, the other receiver whose name escapes me. No disrespect meant to him. Colorado by a field goal.
Okay, I'm going to go Colorado by 14 here. I think I think some guys are starting to show some leadership for Colorado. I think Hunter, there was a spot where one of the receivers was doing some stupid stuff and Hunter's running over to him. I think they're starting to feel like they can get vocal and they can start leading the team. This team's kind of rolling. So, and I don't know what to expect from Utah, like you said, without Cam Rising. So I'm thinking 2 touchdowns. So now we go to Auburn, and Auburn comes off a bye week and hosts UL Monroe. And here's a little bit of info before we look at this one. Um, Auburn's quarterback is injured. There's a shoulder injury. He did not practice all week last week. Obviously, he's felt a lot of heat this season. We are at the point of the season where if you start a true freshman, he will not lose his red shirt even if he plays the rest of the year. So there's a possibility here that we all of a sudden see a third quarterback starting for Auburn, and that would be Walker White. This is the guy that was really vocal to a lot of the receivers coming in the offseason that Auburn brought in. So that's just a little bit of information. So who knows at this point who the quarterback's going to be for Auburn? Auburn's favored by 24. I think it's a bigger number. I think Auburn by 30 because it's just a talent difference.
Yeah, I mean, Louisiana Monroe shouldn't be able to tie Auburn's cleats. Let's be honest about it.
Yeah, there's
Um,
no Diego Pavia on UL Monroe.
no. This will be a game Auburn wins big. I mean, let them win by 30, Terry. Why not? Give
We'll
them
go with
30. LSU goes to Gainesville, the swamp, to play the Gators. 4-point favorite coming off an ass whooping from Alabama. Florida, very thin everywhere, including the quarterback position. Who do you think, sir?
Got to have some nerve and take some risks sometimes. I go Florida by 3.
Yeah, so I'm going to do uncharacteristic of myself here, and I'm going to say LSU wins this by a touchdown. I think they have got to have a game
Yeah,
that shows they're still the the Louisiana State University Tigers, and they haven't done that this year.
right.
And it proves how important Jaden Daniels was to that team last year. So, up next, 4 o'clock, either on NBC or Fox, I'm sure, based on the time. Nebraska visits the Coliseum with the new offensive coordinator, Dana Holgerson, calling the plays. Air raid, Terry. So I guess, sometimes the answer is as simple as what's sitting in front of you. If you have a 3 to 5 step drop back quarterback, what kind of offense do you think you should run? One that he can throw the ball successfully in. That's the answer, sir. Dana Holgerson, as the head coach of West Virginia, as the head coach of Houston, as the offensive coordinator of Texas Tech, architected multiple offenses with 1,000-yard rushers and 2 and 3,000-yard passers. He is now mid-season, 3 games left, the offensive coordinator of the University of Nebraska. This changes everything for SC's defensive scheme against Nebraska. I think you're going to see a lot more complexities and a lot more interesting plays versus what's been called. I'm taking the Huskers, of course. I'm going to take them in the Coliseum. SC is not nearly this good, and Nebraska is a far better team than what they've shown. Taking the Huskers by 10. 19-point swing.
All right. So this -9 number confused me when I first saw it. USC's favored by 9 at home against Nebraska because
And by the way, not to interrupt you, they're benching their starting quarterback at USC.
yeah, I just unless this
Miller,
guy comes in and is on fire, I don't see this.
but they're also hedging their bet that I about said Martinez, son of a bitch, Andrew, that Dylan Raiola is not going to be as good. He's got the back contusion.
Okay.
But
But
your call, my
USC's
man.
not USC doesn't have an impressive record this year. I just don't see this. Um, I'll take USC, but I'm going to take them by 3.
It's fair. Like I said, it's the Coliseum. It's an away game. And Nebraska's new offensive coordinator is unproven, but I think
Right.
we have the right guy. I think
Yeah,
we now have the right chef with all the ingredients. The problem is you can have all the ingredients to bake a cake. If you don't mix it right, you ain't gonna get a cake.
that's
That
correct, and that
simple.
happens a lot in college football. Let's move to the SEC, and we got Missouri traveling to South Carolina. South Carolina favored by 11.5 against Missouri.
It's a big number.
It is.
Gamecocks, they're on a roll. Missouri had to really fight and claw to win their game this past weekend. Took a last minute turnover with a scoop and score.
Right.
Um, Give me the Gamecocks by 6.
I'll take the Gamecocks by 4. So we're thinking pretty similarly.
No. I mean, I think Missouri's a better football team than what they've shown this year.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to give the Cox, double digit lead over Missouri. I'm
Right.
just okay. Up next, Oregon, the presumptive Big Ten champion versus Wisconsin, Camp Randall, 7:30, under the lights. It's dark. It's November football, but Wisconsin is absent those big running backs that made them such a formidable team for so long.
Right.
No Melvin Gordon, Terry. No James White. Um, no Rondé. I think it was
Hmm.
Rondell. Whatever.
Rondé. Yeah.
Rondé. Uh, Oregon by 28. 14 ain't enough. Even at Camp Randall. Oregon by 28.
All right.
And
I'm going
this
to
is
say
why.
what I
Hold
think.
on.
Go ahead.
Iowa hung 42 on Wisconsin.
Yeah,
Iowa is not Oregon. So
not at
give me
all.
Oregon by 28.
Well, I'm going to go with the number I was thinking before you said your number. Oregon by 24. I think this 14 is a joke.
I mean, I don't think Wisconsin's got the goods to stop Oregon,
No.
even at home. I don't think they've got it. Now, interestingly, speaking of if they've got it or not, Tennessee coming off of another win against Georgia, coming off of a loss in Athens, and Georgia's favored by 9.
Yeah, that kills me too. That seems like a huge number.
I mean, I think it would be a 3-point game. No
Yeah,
matter who you pick, I would think it'd be a field goal.
yeah.
Who you got,
I
Terry?
I got Georgia by 4. It's at Georgia. I think Georgia has been inconsistent, but I think they're going to be up for this Tennessee game at home. They're coming off a loss, kind of an embarrassing loss. I think they're ready for Tennessee, but I think it's going to be a dogfight, and I think the Bulldogs win by 4.
This is a make or break season for both of them.
Right,
Because let's face it, whoever loses, well, I guess Tennessee theoretically could lose and still make the playoff. Our voters don't think Georgia's a top 10 football team right now.
right.
So Georgia has a lot to prove. I think Georgia's defense is so good. They're going to pressure Josh Heupel. Heifel's offense has not shown up in the back half of the season, in my opinion. Not that team that's so good. I want them by 3. I'll take the Dogs because they're at home.
All right. In the final game we're going to pick, we got Kansas, who we talked about not having much of a season and then just showing out last weekend. They're traveling to BYU. Undefeated BYU is favored by 3 points late at night. It's a 10:15 Eastern kick. BYU favored by 3. I think it's more like 7. BYU stays undefeated.
I'm going to flip it, buddy, and say Kansas is going to steal this one from BYU,
Look at you.
and I'm going to take them by 2 field goals, not just one. Give me Kansas rather, upsetting BYU by 6.
All right. It'll be something good to talk about next week. And speaking of something good to talk about, I'm extending my lead with this college pick'em, 65-44 now. Bryant has found his way back into the top 3, and Kingra, who I don't even know who that is, maybe it's somebody that doesn't even listen to us, is in third. Same number of wins as Bryant, but 2 more losses, and that's the college pick'em for this week.
Yeah, I'm half-ass paying attention to you at this point on these. I just am not very good at these teams that shouldn't matter, and the SEC has not done me any favors this year.
I'm going to run the ball the rest of the fourth quarter.
Correct. Yeah.
Don't fumble, run the ball, pick the favorite. So you guys heard what I said. I'm just picking the favorites from here on out.
Yeah. Well, and being 6 up is huge because you got 3 weeks left ish.
That's right.
And then we'll get to pick the Big 12. Not that conference, but the tournament. So we'll see. Buddy, it's been fun. It's good. We're a few minutes over. We keep adding segments to this show. But we're not
It's fun,
talking
though.
we're not talking 3 hours about one game though.
That's right. Not yet.
Not yet. The Iron Bowl has not happened.
That's
Although
right.
I don't think Terry's going to want to talk about this particular installment of the Iron Bowl for 3 hours.
I got to tell you, if we have an Iron Bowl to even talk about, it will be a victory for this season, no matter what the end results is. But whatever, that's where we are at the moment. But thanks everybody for voting. Thanks for tuning in, watching, listening. We really appreciate you all. And for Andrew and for Allison, I got one final thought. Be a champ this week at everything that you do. Have a good week, everybody.